December 24th, 1958. The Green Bay Packers had just completed their worst season in their entire history, posting a horrendous record of 10 losses, 1 tie, and just 1 single win. Packers head coach Scooter McLean was on his way out, but not before a Christmas Eve farewell party. Green Bay had come a long way from the winning days of Coach Curly Lambeau, who led the Packers to championships from 1929 to 1931, and then in 1936, 1939, and 1944. In fact, not even Lambeau was able to keep things up as he finished his Packers career in 1949 with a 2-10 record, thus leading to his own departure. Things would not get much better in the 1950s as there wouldn't be a single winning season. Present at that Christmas party was the Green Bay Press-Gazette sports writer Art Daley, who must have been wondering what would come next. The Packers organization wasn't sticking its head in the sand, though. When they saw an effigy of Dominic Olejniczak, president of Green Bay's executive committee, swinging from a lamppost, they knew the bad sentiment wasn't isolated. To deal with this growing unrest, the Packers needed a change. So just shortly prior to this, on December 16, 1958, it was announced they were going to hire a new general manager and give him broad powers that included overseeing coaching. The organization was desperate, and they were willing to sacrifice their ego to whomever could deliver. After the party ended, ex-coach McLean ended up at Daley's house, where they cooked some eggs and drank a final round together. Daley reflected on McLean's attitude during the whole affair. He took it all right. What the hell? Only won 1 game. To fill that void, there was talk about getting Curly Lambeau back. Lambeau heard fans rumbling about this, so he sent a wire to the front office promoting himself as a new general manager and the answer to their problems. Following this, he flew back to Green Bay to meet with Olejniczak, the aforementioned victim of the mock pre-Christmas hanging. However, despite Lambeau's past success, the board was skeptical as they remembered the last 2 losing seasons he had. The game seemed to have passed him by, and ultimately his overtures were rejected. As historic as Lambeau had been for the team, the Packers wanted to go in a different direction. So, how did things get so bad? To understand this, let's backtrack to early 1958, when it was announced that Raymond Scooter McLean had been named the new coach of the Packers. It actually wasn't McLean's first foray into coaching Green Bay, as back in 1953, he had been an interim head coach, finishing with a record of 0-2. This time, it would be for an entire season, although his contract would run out at the end of the year. The Packers had won only 3 games in 1957, but there was some room for optimism for 1958, as they had enjoyed a great draft. Much of this can be attributed to Jack Vanese, who was a scout and personnel director for the Packers. Vanese had come from a family closely tied to the Chicago Bears, as they had owned a deli near Wrigley Field that some of the players would visit. Vanese would go on to play college football at Notre Dame for 1 year before being drafted into the Army and being sent to Japan for the post-World War II occupation. It was here that he developed rheumatic fever that would damage his heart and dramatically shorten his lifespan. He didn't let this condition keep him away from the sport, though. Despite not being able to play it anymore, he was able to still be involved behind the scenes, and it was through his family's connection with the Bears that he was able to get a scouting job with the Packers, as former Chicago player Gene Ronzani, who was acquainted with his family, had been named the new Green Bay coach in 1950. Vanese soon started networking with college coaches all throughout the country, and leading up to the start of the 1958 season, the Packers, with his help, had compiled these future Hall of Fame football players. In 1953, they got center Jim Ringo. In 1956, they got guard Forrest Gregg and quarterback Bart Starr. In 1957, they got halfback Paul Harding. And in 1958, they got fullback Jim Taylor, linebacker Ray Nitschke, and guard Jerry Kramer. Because of this, Coach McLean had perhaps some reason for positivity. So what went wrong? For one, McLean was too nice. He had the attitude of trying to be friends with the players, and as an assistant coach, he perhaps could get away with that. But as a new head coach, the responsibility of discipline would ultimately fall on him, and even if he wanted to be tough, the sudden switch in personality wouldn't be viewed as authentic. McLean would often play poker with them, and when a coach loses the players and owes them money, it breaks the perception of hierarchy a little. In fact, Packers end Gary Knafleck had this to say. He was a great guy, but he had no leadership qualities. He was not demanding. If you've been around ball players, you know they'll take you to the hilt every time. They'll drive you. They'll get everything they can out of you, and we took Scooter in every way. Under McLean, curfews were ignored and players skipped team meetings. On top of this, his coaching style seemed erratic and sometimes void of logic. Quarterback Bart Starr recalled that in some games, a player would make a mistake, so McLean would bench them. Then the backup would make a mistake too, and the original player would get sit back in. This lack of decisiveness demonstrated poor long-term planning. And what about the players overall? Well, the main issue, at least on offense, was blocking. Although they would be only 1 year away from the historic 1959 turnaround, their starting lineup for this Packers front five was very different. At left tackle, we had Norm Masters. At left guard, Hank Bulla. At center, Jim Ringo. At right guard, Jim Salisbury. And at right tackle, Ollie Spencer. Of these players, the only standout was center Jim Ringo. Aside from him, the other linemen would have a combined 0 Pro Bowls for their entire careers. Let me repeat, not a single lineman aside from Ringo would ever make the Pro Bowl, and this was in a league that had only 12 teams. You would think with a league that small that one of the 4 other men would have managed to make it at least once by accident, but no, not even one time. So Bart Starr, who had begun the season as the Packers' starting quarterback, had the deck stacked against him. Receivers Max McGee and Billy Houghton had decent stats, but that was only when the Packers' quarterbacks were able to get the ball out to them in the first place. On the running side, the final tally was a bit strange as backs Paul Hornung, Howie Ferguson, and Jim Taylor all averaged at least 4.5 yards per carry, but Don McElhaney only averaged 3.2 yards, and he only had a few more carries than the others, so the higher averages of the rest can't just be chalked up to sampling error. Overall, though, the running game was a bright spot, but what about the defense? This is where things got bad. Really bad. Despite some silver linings with the linebackers, they couldn't stop the run, giving up an average of 4.8 yards per carry, and their defense against the pass gave up 24 touchdown passes, and again, this was in just 12 games. To put this into perspective, that same year, the Baltimore Colts, the champions of the West, gave up just 9 touchdown passes all year, while the Giants, the champions of the East, gave up 11. The Packers were a mess. Paul Mazzolini, a gas station owner who ran Paul's Standard Service, said he would often see head coach McLean when he stopped by on his way to work. McLean would ask him what he was doing wrong, as he couldn't understand how things had gotten so out of control. According to Mazzolini, McLean even started to cry when venting his frustrations. If this story is accurate, it aptly demonstrates a person who was in over his head with stress and probably didn't even need to be in a head coaching position anywhere, let alone on an NFL team. One of the many things that helped put extra pressure on McLean was the recent completion of City Stadium, later to be renamed Lambeau Field in 1965. This 32,150-seat venue was opened the year prior in 1957, and the cost of this, combined with the knee-deep fans in the stands, led to McLean being questioned by the Packer board every Monday after every loss in a series of meetings that must have been emasculating. The consensus seemed to be that everyone liked him as a person, but not as a head coach. Fast forward to the end of the year, and after the Christmas party, we have McLean leaving Art Daly's house as a defeated man. McLean would go off to Detroit to work as an assistant, while the Packers organization desperately looked for someone else. Someone that could right the ship. Someone that could save the franchise. This is the story of that someone. This is the story of Vince Lombardi and the 1959 Green Bay Packers. After going through literally hundreds of newspaper articles, I have compiled a mixture of forgotten stories, confirmed falsehoods, and minutiae. I will be combining this information along with multiple autobiographies and interviews from the men and women who were there to form a more complete picture of the events that transpired in 1959. Because of the sheer volume of research, this video will end in the middle of 1959. That's right, we're not even going to get to training camp just yet. That will have to be saved for part 2. Instead, we're going to be covering what Lombardi did behind the scenes to create the framework for the turnaround. We'll cover how he analyzed game film, the offensive changes he made, the assistant coaches he picked, and the off-season trades to assemble a squad that was an instant wake-up call to the rest of the NFL that something was different in Green Bay. This wasn't a franchise that was going to be pushed around anymore. Then in part 2, I will backtrack and I'll use the autobiographies Bart Starr, Paul Hornung, Jerry Kramer, and a book of compiled interviews of Ray Nitschke to fill us in with additional information on what the football culture was like before that very first day of the 1959 training camp. Then, using Lombardi's own words combined with more newspaper accounts, we'll recap training camp before covering the entire regular season. I hope to do the most extensive documentary on Lombardi's first season ever, and with these multiple first-hand sources, I also hope for it to be the most accurate. Now, let's get started. Art Daily is a primary source for much of what was initially written about Vince Lombardi during his first years in Green Bay, and here, on January 3rd, 1959, in the Green Bay Press-Gazette, we can see the first mention of Lombardi being named as one of the possible candidates for the next Packers head coaching job. Nothing of substance is said about him. In fact, you have to go toward the end of the article to even see his name being mentioned. However, since the 1958 NFL Championship overtime game, where he coached the New York Giants offense in a close but losing effort to the Baltimore Colts, he had been on people's minds. There is one correction I wanted to make. In another video, I said that when he was hired by the Packers, that it was mostly false that Lombardi was viewed as a gamble due to the fact that he had no head coaching experience aside from doing it in high school. Despite this, he had built up his reputation as an assistant coach, first through his time with West Point and their heyday with head coach Red Blake, and then with an assistant spot with the New York Giants, where he helped them win the 1956 NFL Championship game. So it would be better to say that he was thought of as a good pick for those familiar with him. For example, the Philadelphia Eagles wanted Lombardi to be their head coach, but he turned them down. And if you go by the account of Wellington Mara, who was the Giants' co-owner, he wanted Lombardi for the top spot. However, the situation with New York head coach Jim Lee Howe and when he would retire got in the way of things. Outside of the tri-state area, however, for those who hadn't heard of him yet, there may have been some question marks. This is in part due to how low profile an assistant coach could be in the 1950s when compared to modern times. If you go by Art Daly's account, the Packers in early 1959 didn't have a lot of choices. Daly wrote, "Who are the candidates for the Packer job? Just name anybody but the 11 other head coaches in the league and the long-time established college coaches, and you have a candidate." Nice sarcastic exclamation point. For those still claiming most people thought he was a gamble, it should also be noted since Coach Curly Lambeau had left the Packers after 1949, every coach afterward had a losing record. So long before Lombardi was announced as taking over, expectations weren't sky high, so it would seem a little silly to do extra complaining about this. You can't hire Lombardi. What if he fails miserably? Just like the other 3 full-time head coaches we just had. So it would be better to say that while Lombardi's opportunity to become a head coach was delayed compared to most other people, by the time the 1958 season had ended, the ones who did know about him thought he was a great choice. Getting back to the previous article, in terms of the order of coaches listed as candidates, Daly listed Lombardi 5th, but this appears to be in no particular order, but instead a general listing of names. However, if at the time Daly had personally favored him, or he heard the Packers were looking at him more closely, he may have put Lombardi closer to the top of the paragraph, but given the context of the article, the order shouldn't be given that much importance. And demonstrating how 1950s sports coverage lacked the desire for constant updates, even if there were no updates to give, Lombardi's name isn't mentioned again until January 28, 1959, 25 days later. Seriously, imagine if ESPN assigned people to cover who was going to be the new Packers coach, and literally 25 days passed before the guy who would eventually get the job is finally mentioned again. There is actually something somewhat refreshing about the lack of repetitive speculation. So the Packers reach out to Lombardi by calling him at his house. Well, at least Jack Vanisi does. When Lombardi picked up the phone, Vanisi opened the conversation by stating, "I don't have the authority to make this call, but I'm curious to know whether you're interested." Lombardi had just started an off-season job at the Federation Bank and Trust, and although a possible head coaching position might have opened up in New York in the near future, nothing was certain. Lombardi said he was intrigued, as even though he had previously turned down the Philadelphia spot, the Packers were offering something the Eagles couldn't: complete control. Vanisi had done his homework in Lombardi, and before placing that call, he had interviewed Paul Brown of the Cleveland Browns, George Halas of the Chicago Bears, NFL Commissioner Burt Bell, and Red Blake, the college coach of Army, whom Lombardi had served under. All of them said he was an excellent choice. So hearing Vanisi hype up Lombardi, the Packers decided to reach out to Jack and Wellington Merritt for permission to talk to Lombardi, which they granted under one condition. If the Giants ever needed another coach, Wellington could reach out to Lombardi again. So on January 22, 1959, at the Warwick Hotel in Philadelphia, when the league was meeting to conduct the final rounds of the draft, the Packers took the opportunity to approach Lombardi. While their sentiments about the small Green Bay market, combined with their terrible record, supposedly led to one man confronting Alenichek near the hotel elevators. "You're nothing but parasites. You couldn't last in the league if not for the big checks you take away from other teams in the conference." Alenichek responded, "You just wait. We're going to get a man who will impress you." So Alenichek walked up to Lombardi, who was at the Giants draft table, and told him to come with him so the two could have a private conversation. While they were going through the lobby together, Ray Scott, the Packers television announcer, noticed Lombardi and immediately thought he was about to see much more of him. However, not everyone at the hotel predicted it correctly. For example, the Milwaukee Journal thought James Trimble, the Canadian Football League coach, was going to get the job. Lombardi walked into Alenichek's room, and there they met with Tony Canadeo, the former Packers back, who is now a member of the board. Lombardi wouldn't commit to the job just then, but he did tell them about how he would run the organization, and he brought up that he was the highest paid assistant in the league, and his wife wouldn't want to leave New York unless a higher salary and a nice house could be provided. Canadeo reflected on the meeting. He knew where he was going. In football terminology, he knew his game plan. The next day, he was flown to Green Bay to be interviewed. When the plane landed, Lombardi was met by Canadeo and Vice President Dick Burnian. He was taken to the H.C. Prang department store to meet Chairman and Director Jerry Atkinson. On the way there, Burnian asked Lombardi if he thought New York would release him from his contract. Lombardi said Jack Murray's response was, "Let your good judgment and training be your guide." This was in reference to their shared Jesuit training. Burnian then mentioned he too went to a Jesuit school, followed by Canadeo, who brought up that he went to Gonzaga. All three of them, by happenstance, were Catholics. When Lombardi met with Atkinson, Atkinson wrote down the positives in coming to Green Bay. He would get more money, management would stay out of the way, the team was filled with talent, and if he improved them, he would get all the credit, and living in Wisconsin was much cheaper than New York. After outlining all of this, they made Lombardi an offer. Lombardi recounted, "They told me the job was mine, and I told them the salary was not enough. I gave them another figure, which they met. They agreed on a $36,000 a year salary for 5 years. Lombardi, on an impulse, then found a house he liked in the area, and then he took the proposal back to the Maris. Wellington told him Green Bay was the right place and gave him his blessing. On the way back home, Lombardi stopped by the town of Remsen, New Jersey to visit Jack Clark, who had known the Lombardi since their time in Inglewood. They sat for hours smoking cigarettes in Clark's living room as they discussed whether or not he should go to Green Bay. When he got home to his wife Marie, his brother Joe was also there, and he told both of them that he had decided to go to Green Bay, and, as an aside, he'd also found a house. The next night, at a dinner for Fordham alumni at the Waldorf Astoria, Marie, showing misgivings about the big change, pleaded with Wellington Mara to enforce the Giants' contract and not let Lombardi go to Green Bay. However, Wellington didn't relent, telling Marie he thought that was the best place. So Lombardi was going to go to Green Bay. However, there was one matter that still needed to be resolved. The Packers board of directors, numbering 45 members, had to give official approval. And word of this can be observed here, with a paper mentioning Lombardi getting hired as a likelihood. However, things were delayed due to the board having to hold this meeting. So they convened at the Hotel Northland for the vote. The board met in a section of the hotel known as the Italian Room. 17 reporters in total crammed into room 173 waiting for the results. Finally, Olenicek came out to meet the press, where he read the bio of a man named Lombardi. Lombardi, at his end, was back in New York at the Hotel Manhattan. The press came to his room to take photos and watch as he took a congratulatory phone call from the Packers. And here, on the January 29th, 1959 edition of the Gazette, it formally announced Lombardi getting the job in a unanimous selection, and that he would be coming to Green Bay the following Monday to formally sign the documents to become the new head coach and GM. And here you can see the photo of Lombardi standing by an open suitcase. This, of course, was not actually an image of him packing up to move. It instead was for a single visit there for a few days. The logistics and actual moving of his family would take place on a later trip, with Lombardi noting he planned on starting his job in about 2 weeks. To put it into perspective of just how powerful Lombardi had become relative to other coaches, only Paul Brown at the Cleveland Browns also had the title of both coach and GM. Furthermore, the article stated that Lombardi, as general manager, would have fewer people from the executive committee to deal with, as the size was being reduced down from 13 to 6, and they would now be meeting only once a month instead of weekly. So many teams, even in modern times, can get in the way when they encounter a talented coach because their ego doesn't want them to give up control. But the people in Green Bay, to their credit, knew what they were doing in the 1950s wasn't working, and they were willing to give control not just on the football field, but behind the scenes as well. Lombardi mentioned he was going to install the T formation with flanking variations, and he would have to review the current players he had before entertaining bringing in new ones from outside Green Bay. As an example, take the case of quarterback George Shaw. If you've never heard of him, there is a reason for that. But for a short period of time, he was a hot property because he was the backup to the Baltimore Colts quarterback Johnny Unitas, and when Unitas went down for a few games in the 1958 season, Shaw played well. So there was interest in him, especially in New York. However, Lombardi said he would reserve judgment. Well, the Giants would later take action, and Shaw would be signed in 1960, and New York got nothing for it. In fairness to Shaw, he suffered a thumb injury, so he was mostly on the bench. However, when he was traded to the Vikings in 1961, he played somewhat okay, but he was later benched for Fran Tarkenton before later being sent to the Broncos in 1962, and after that, he would never play again. When it came to Shaw, Lombardi wasn't being a prisoner of the moment. On this issue, Lombardi said, "I know George Shaw, but I won't do any trading until I look over our present quarterbacks in the films. That may take a couple weeks, and I don't know if Baltimore will wait that long." He would later elaborate on trading in general. "I believe in trading future draft picks for proven pro players, but I have no trade plans right now. I can't think of trading until I see our pictures and the results of grading the players." Scrolling further down the page, we see both Paul Brown and George Halas discussing what a good choice Lombardi was, and to the left side, we see NFL Commissioner Bert Bell also hyping up Lombardi. Lombardi said he might bring his wife with him to Wisconsin for the contract signing, and he'd have to sell his house in Fairhaven, New Jersey. but he contemplated not moving his family there until school was out. And to do a bit of fact-checking, Lombardi, in his own words, recounted how the Packers approached him for the job, and his account matches up with the other retellings I just mentioned. However, as was said earlier, not everyone in Green Bay was familiar with who Lombardi even was. For example, Wayne Vander Patten, a local broadcaster, had heard the news of his hiring during a basketball game, and he supposedly blurted out, "Who the hell is Vince Lombardi?" So it seemed at least a few introductions were in order. When Bart Starr found out, he barely recognized the name, but then he saw Lombardi's face in the paper, and his mind immediately flashed back to a preseason game in Fenway Park where the Packers were playing the Giants. New York had just scored, and as Starr was marching off the field, a field in which the Giants and the Packers shared the same sideline, he noticed an assistant coach yelling at the Giants' defense for giving up a score. Let me repeat. An offensive coach was yelling at his team's own defense. He was taking the initiative a head coach normally takes. Starr realized that this was Lombardi, and he smiled to himself. He would be no Scooter McLean. It is important to note, though, that despite Lombardi taking over, he didn't have the benefit of participating in the NFL draft due to it already having been held prior to his hiring, as the draft back then was held much earlier than in modern times. Without that extra benefit of being able to choose new rookies, it adds to just how impressive Lombardi's first season with the Packers really was. Now, I want to take the time to discuss what was going on in Green Bay during this time period, not just with football, but with life in general. So we're going to take a quick detour and look through the newspaper of the Green Bay Press-Gazette for Thursday, January 29th, 1959, the date the paper announced Lombardi had been hired. On the front page, an article discussed how the country's first base with intercontinental ballistic missiles was coming to Camp Cook in July of 1959, which is a stark reminder of how tense the Cold War was. The weather was predicted to be freezing rain and drizzle with a nighttime low of 22 degrees. So, in other words, short-sleeved Wisconsin weather. Here, we see a list of people who either checked into hospitals or recently checked out. That's right, in the newspaper, they gave the first and last names and addresses of people who were in the hospital. Personal information didn't matter. The newspaper would just tell people this. The Walgreens at Washington and Maine showcased some of their deals, and here we can check out the differences between these prices and modern day ones. The paper had a reporter talk to young people, the rock and roll set as he called it, and here we learned teenagers in the area were health conscious and counting calories, including one teenager who took a break from talking about the importance of health to discuss her cigarettes. This had to have been a pretty bad assignment, a grown man going up to teenagers to find out the truth of what they're into.
How do you do, fellow kids?
Senator John F. Kennedy headed a Senate subcommittee on how to deal with the retirement and benefit issues of senior citizens, and the paper listed an example of a woman trying to collect benefits, but she was apparently so out of it, she couldn't remember how old she was. So she said, "All I know is the first thing I remember was Mr. Lincoln was president." And playing in local Green Bay theaters, you had movies like The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, The Last Mile, The Last Hurrah, and Gigi. And the number one song was Smoke Gets in Your Eyes. Okay, moving on. On January 30th, Art Daly gauged the feeling around town about Lombardi, and as noted earlier, many were unfamiliar with him, but once his background was explained, Daly wrote fan reaction was, "I hope he makes good. He sounds like he knows his stuff. Let's give him time, and we can't expect him to set the league on fire right away." David Condon of the Chicago Tribune did a piece where he took several quotes about Lombardi together, which included Lombardi's wife, Marie. Vince is still very loyal to Fordham. He attended an alumni dinner Tuesday. He likes golf and occasionally plays bridge and gin rummy when traveling with the team, but it's difficult to get him to relax during football season. Not only have to leave an off-season baking job he had in New York. I was in New York with him when we got the word. I came out to Fairhaven to be with our children. I'm still numb with excitement. Fairhaven is my family home, so it isn't easy to break away. The best thing would be to pack up the kids and get to Green Bay right away. On Monday, February 2nd, 1959, Lombardi showed up in Wisconsin to sign the contract, stepping off a North Central Airlines plane where he was greeted by reporters at the terminal of Austin-Straubel Field. There was a moment of silence, and then the first question came, asking Lombardi where his son, Vince Jr., would go to high school. This led to laughter, including from Lombardi, as it was a bit of an odd question to start off with, but he answered by looking at his wife Marie and stating they would let their son decide where he wanted to go. Although the paper doesn't recount all the other questions, here's an excerpt of some of his responses as recounted in the February 3rd, 1959 edition of the Green Bay Press-Gazette. I expect to take a more active approach in coaching than Jim. I'll have a coach in charge of offense and one in charge of defense, but I'll work more with my assistants than Jim did with us. Yes, I'd say I'd put my best players on defense, but that's a general view. I certainly don't intend to have Billy Houghton, for instance, playing defense. It means I'll emphasize defense a little more. A good defense is a great morale factor. It hurts the bench and the offense when a team is getting run over and scored on. I have given considerable thought to my adjustments in coaching. I realize it will be different here when most everybody knows the players personally. The coaches and the players have an entirely different problem compared to large city players who can easily get lost. I hope to hold workouts down to an hour and a half, an hour and 15 minutes if possible. The players will know exactly what they'll do in every minute of practice. I want to get the assistants lined up quickly because of the monumental job ahead. We got to look over the films and grade all the offensive players, every one of them. We'll also grade the defensive players. The grading will be of special value in judging our offensive material. There's a good nucleus of veteran players, boys like Ringo, Curry, Bettis, a tough linebacker, and Nitschke. I understand Forrester didn't have a good year in '58, but he might have a great one next season. Duncan, we're going after him quite soon, and I may go out to see him. I understand he's going into the Army for 6 months, but he should be out in time. I understand this training set up here, and at St. Norbert is fine. I'll decide later where to train. I've already got a telegram from Stevens Point. As an aside, the Packers would continue to train at St. Norbert. After he left the airport, Lombardi and some of the Packers personnel, including President Olejniczak, drove toward the stadium in a procession of cars. However, they allegedly weren't coming to complete stops at every stop sign, so a state trooper pulled them over and politely told them to follow the signs. Olejniczak gave them a quick tour around Green Bay and Dupere, including driving them past several homes. It was mentioned that the Lombardis were going to rent a home first for a few months before finally buying. Lombardi then went to meet the press for a luncheon at the Hotel Northland. This was filmed, however it seems, like many things from this time period, to be lost to history. However, a few photos were taken, and Lombardi was quoted as saying, "I want it understood, I am in complete command. I expect full cooperation from you people, and you will get full cooperation from me in return. You have my confidence, and I want yours." Lombardi added that he was not against anything that will help the Packers. "I've never been associated with a loser, and I don't expect to be now." This claim was false, as his 2 years as an assistant coach at Fordham involved losing seasons. However, for the vast majority of his football career, there had been success. He continued, "The Packers are steeped in tradition. I expect with plenty of hard work to bring them back to the position they were once at. I've had many letters wishing me well, and I've received one of them from a former coach here, Gene Ranzani. He told me what a wonderful place Green Bay is and how wonderful the people are here." And speaking of letters, the Wisconsin state legislature decided to go ahead and raise the pressure by mailing him this, where they not once but twice mentioned the past success of the Packers and how they hope it will continue. It was an interesting way to say congratulations, but also we're watching you. It's there in Green Bay that he needed to reach the decision on who his assistant coaches would be. Nick Skorich, who came to the Packers in 1958, was mentioned by Lombardi as someone who might stay on to coach the line. However, this wasn't to be, as he would go on to become an assistant with Philadelphia that year. Instead, the first confirmed assistant coaching announcement came that very day at the Hotel Northland, where Lombardi said Red Cochran from the Lions would be the backfield coach. The next day, Phil Bingston from the 49ers was announced as a new coach for the defense. There would be another important figure Lombardi decided to keep, the aforementioned talent scout Jack Vinesi. Vern Llewellyn, the man who stepped down as general manager when Lombardi arrived, was listed as a candidate to be his business manager. And while Lombardi met with management, his wife Marie spent the Tuesday of that week at a luncheon at Prang's Terrace Room with the wives of management. Lombardi noted he would put two coaches in the press box, one for offense and one for defense, and he would be using the same picture system of taking photos from there, this time maybe using a combination of runners and the old sock method he had used with the Giants, where a photograph from up above would be placed in a sock and lowered down to the sideline via rope. When asked about how they were going to juggle 5 different potential quarterbacks, namely Bart Starr, Babe Pirelli, Joe Francis, Randy Duncan, and Bob Webb, he had this to say. That's not too many for training camp. The ideal setup for the season is 3, with one of those as a defensive back or even a 5th man on defense. We're not overstocked at QB for training. Even before training camp, when he was going over the film, Lombardi wrote he saw something in Bart Starr. He said the consensus was Starr wouldn't make it and no one had confidence in him. What Lombardi didn't know was what type of inner strength Starr had, and Lombardi would later rate him as the greatest quarterback ever, not because of necessarily his physical abilities, but he instead put him at the top because he could win. And to win in 1959 would be a tall order, and the first step in this goal would begin with the start of training camp, where Lombardi would put to bed any illusions this was going to be just another season of going through the motions. He was here to win, and the team and the culture were forever going to be changed. That's all for now. When we continue, we'll discuss the early years of Bart Starr, Paul Hornung, Ray Nitschke, and Jerry Kramer, and then we'll recap the training camp and the 1959 regular season that would have the Packers go from being the worst in the league into a team that was on the precipice of becoming the most dominating force in pro football for nearly the next decade. See you next time.